Hey everyone, welcome back to Miniature Painting 101, a series of videos where I teach you all about painting miniatures from start to finish and everything in between, including glazes. And in this video I'll be talking about painting yellow using glazes, specifically a yellow glaze from Games Workshop. So, I of course started by priming the model white using Stynylrez primer from Badger. Obviously you want to paint the model white since it produces the truest color, and we're going to go in with relatively light colors today. You want to be painting white. Makes sense. And of course, we are going to be working on the warm side of white. So we're going to be starting off with Shapty Bone, and then working our way through Screaming Skull, and then White Scar, and then finally tying it all together with Lamenter's Yellow Glaze. The reason, of course, is because you want a nice warm yellow. You don't want a cold yellow, so of course you want to go on the warmer side of the spectrum. So we're going to take some Shapty Bone and put it into our wet palette as always. I love using my wet palette because obviously it keeps the paints nice and wet, and when you want to go back and use them, you can, because obviously in this step you'll see I will go through the process a few times. And I'm going to take some Lamium Medium. I'm going to thin down my paints. I like nice and thin down paints, so it'll be about a 3-to-2 mix of paint to Lamium Medium. It's going to be nice and thin. I want to do 2 thin coats as opposed to 1 thick, clumpy coat. You don't want that. You don't want to obscure any details, especially in this process where we're going to be using several paints over to create the yellow color. You don't want thick paints. So I'm just going to take a nice base coating brush here and apply a nice thin coat to the miniature. And as you can see, of course, it's good that we went over with white. Now, of course, the important parts when you're painting over a primed white is that you got to make sure you get complete coverage of all the areas you're going to be painting with this color. The biggest problem is, of course, that if you miss an area, it will appear white in the recesses, and that just doesn't look right. As you see, it doesn't make sense that something would have a white shadow in the recess. So you want to make sure you get complete coverage, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to paint over all the miniature here. As you can see, I'm just getting a nice, good coat of thinned down Shapty Bone on all of the parts. And I'm intentionally missing some areas like the gun, the leather areas, some of the metal, because I know I'll be painting this with metal later, but that's okay. As I said, you can paint the entire miniature if you want, but it's okay. So after it's dry, as you can see, it's pretty good, but there's a little bit of streakiness on some of the areas like the leg, as you can see. So all I'm going to do is going to take a Shapty Bone and do one more thin coat and get it nice and cleaned up. And as you can see, after this coat, it's going to be much cleaner, much nicer, much more uniform. Obviously, this is completely up to you. Now, I'm painting a Space Marine today. I'm going to be painting armor, but you can apply this technique to pretty much any yellow. It's just up to you what kind of shade you want. And so when I go over the next step for the shade, this is just my preference for yellow armor. Feel free to use whatever shade or whatever thickness of shade you wish. As you can see, I'm just going over the miniature once again and getting a nice solid coat over the entire miniature with Shapty Bone. And once that's all dried, as you can see now, it is significantly cleaner. And look at that, it's much more uniform, much cleaner, and it's looking good. So now I'm going to take non-oil, which is not the default shade for yellow. The reason why I like this is I like my armor having deep, dark, exaggerated recesses. Feel free to try it out. I actually really do like the combination of yellow and dark black shading, but if you want to go with much more subtle tones, I'd recommend an Agrex Earth shade, something brown. And then within these colors as well, you can thin them down to your liking as well. I'm taking this non-oil straight from the pot and putting it on the miniature. You can thin down the non-oil so that it's a little bit thinner, or you can go with Agrex Earth shade, or even a thin down Agrex Earth shade. Completely up to you. I recommend trying things out and seeing what you like, depending on what you're painting. Is it a cloak? Is it armor? Is it a vehicle? Completely up to you. Whatever you want to paint yellow, you can apply this method. Just as I said, try and figure out what shading you like. So what I'm doing here is just doing a quick edge shading. As you can see, I'm taking a detail brush and just applying a good amount into all the recesses to give this armor some detail. If this was a cloak, I'd just apply it into the recesses as well. Just very carefully, as you can see. Now, if I do add a little bit too much, I can just clean it up using my finger or a brush, or I can just clean it up after it dries as well by just going back to my wet palette and just cleaning it up a little bit using my Shapty Bone. Once again, it is nice to keep the paints wet on your palette for that exact reason, in case you need them. They're available. So as you can see now, just still applying it into the recesses, into all the edges and the crevices, just to bring out the detail of this miniature. And as you can see, even with the non-oil, it doesn't appear, significantly. It's going to be a black shade, but I still think it really works really well, and you'll see in the end with this armor. I'm not a big fan of the yellowish shades in the recesses for yellow, but I'd go with brown in case you want to go more subtle, like an Agrax Earth shade, as I mentioned. And once that's dried, as you can see, now it has some detail, which is nice, and it's nice and clean. So what we're going to do now is take our Screaming Skull, the next color in our spectrum of warm whites, essentially off-whites. These are essentially bone tones. And we're going to be painting the raised areas of the model, anything that you really want to add a little bit of brightness to. So as you can see, top of the knees, top of the feet, top of the shoulder pads, top of the hands, the helmet, the top of the backpack, anything you really want to make a little bit brighter. And essentially we're just building up tones here, but because Screaming Skull is very close to Shabty Bone as well, it's going to be a nice gradual gradient. And again, if you're painting this on a cloak, you'd just be building up, highlights of the raised areas towards, the top parts of the cloak with, or the cape, or whatever you're painting, the clothing, with the Screaming Skull, right? Just keep it nice and clean. And as always, I thin down all my paints with Lamium Medium for, my Screaming Skull, the white I'm going to use in a moment, and the Shabty Bone we're all thinned down using Lamium Medium. I want to keep nice and thin paints. So as you can see here, just painting the top of the helmet to build up a little bit of a gradient on the top of the helmet. And then the backpack as well, maybe the back parts of the legs, just to draw a little bit of attention to them. As you can see here, just a little bit of highlighting up to make it look nice and clean. And once that's done, I'm going to now do an edge highlighting with white scar. As I mentioned, I thinned it down with Lamium Medium. I want it nice and clean. But as you can see now, it has a bit of highlighting to it, but it's a very gradual gradient. It's not too extreme. And now I'm going to take some white scar with my detail brush, and I'm just going to paint an edge highlight over certain details. Right now I'm focusing on the feet. As you can see, just doing an edge highlight over the feet to make certain lines really pop and stand out. This would be the ultimate, like the highest points in a trim of clothing, or as you said, the highest points in the armor. There we go. And you see, just focusing on certain details, and this will really make these details pop. And since we're highlighting with a white, this is going to be where the truest color of yellow appears. But as you can see, the glaze that we're going to use today is from Games Workshop, but obviously you can use a glaze from any other company if you prefer. But the glaze really ties everything together and really transitions this to yellow. And it's really hard to imagine at this point that this is going to be a yellow miniature, an Imperial Fist. But you'll see in a couple more steps, it's really going to be tied together and clean. So right now I'm just picking up details with my brush, the hand, the tips of the elbows, a little bit on the shoulder. I do basically where the eyebrows would be on him, kind of thing, right above the eyes, the top of the helmet, just to do a nice trim and to bring this all together. Just a quick edge highlight, but it really does work. And the key is for this step, once again, is a thinned down white. You don't want it to be clumpy. It really ruins the edges if you put a nice clumpy amount of white paint on it. And there we go. And after the edges are all painted white, it's time to tie this all together. Now this is my favorite step in the entire process. Let's take a good amount of Lamenter's Yellow. I'm just using my shading brush, and I'm going to apply a nice coat of it over the miniature. Now I do keep the coats relatively thin. I prefer to do 2 thin coats once again, because you'll see the yellow, any of the glazes, specifically from Games Workshop, but glazes in general, they tend to do 2 coats to really bring it to life. The first coat tends to be a little bit transparent, but that's okay. They can dry incredibly dark if you just throw a clump of paint or glaze on it. So you just want to take your time and do a nice thin coat, and then we'll repeat the process in a moment as well after it's dried. It does tend to dry pretty quickly. You'll notice that probably by the end of this step, as I'm putting the last part on the model, the part I started with is actually almost dry. It does tend to dry pretty quickly, but I'll obviously let it dry entirely before proceeding to a second coat if needed. So as you can see, just taking a nice amount of shade and applying it over the entire armor of the model. As I said, I could have done the entire miniature if I wanted to, but I am leaving just some parts white because I know I'll be painting them metallic or black or red in the near future, so that's okay. But I'm just going to take a nice thin coat of Lamenter's Yellow and applying it over the miniature. It does take a little bit of time, but that's okay. You know what? It's good to get a nice yellow, and as you can see, the yellow is really starting to form on the miniature. It's still a little more browny yellow than I prefer, and that's why we're going to do a second coat of yellow in after it's done drying. That's okay. So let's just keep going with a nice coat of yellow, and then after it's dried, as you can see, I gave it ample time to dry. It's great for batch painting because then you just let one dry at a time. As you can see, there's a little bit of streakiness specifically on the legs. I've noticed that a bit on the legs and a bit on the backpack. And it's a little bit it's not yellow enough for me. It's a little more brown yellow than I'd prefer. So I'm going to take the Lamenter's Yellow and once again repeat this process. I am going to focus a little bit more attention on the areas that are a little streaky and just to balance them out a little bit like that. As you can see, the one leg is a little bit streaky towards the knee. I'm going to fix that as well by just focusing some more attention on that area and try to make sure that it's nice and balanced. But that's it. So I'm just repeating this process once again, focusing on the entire miniature, of course, because you want it all to be about the same uniform yellow. But as you can see, even with the non-oil, the shade still works quite well in the recesses. It just makes them a little more exaggerated, a little more heavy, but I like that. As I said, if you want to go more reserved, you can either water down the non-oil shading, you can go with an Agrax Earth shade, you can thin down the Agrax Earth shade, you can use a soft body black from Secret Weapon. There's tons of options for shades for this step. But I'm just going to take my time and apply, once again, a nice thin coat over the entire miniature with my Lamenter's Yellow. And right there, just trying to make sure that knee pad, that leg was nice and uniform. And then I'm going to go over it just to make sure, after it dries, I'll take another look at it. But that's it. So after it's done drying, as you can see now, we have a nice bright yellow. It is much more yellow than it was 2 steps ago. And it's really nice, and it is definitely a yellow. And then once all the areas have been painted, this is what the model looks like when it's completely complete. I painted the guns, the shoulder pads, the leather, all the metal, and this is what it looks like. It is a very yellow and nice, and I find it a really nice turnout for an Imperial Fist using glazes, and I really like the way that the yellows turned out. And as you can see, the edge highlighting really makes the certain details pop on the miniature. And that is it. So as always, thank you so much for watching this episode of Miniature Painting 101, and thank you for subscribing to my channel. It really does mean a lot. Stay tuned for next week's episode, part 153, which is just around the corner. Leave comments in the comment section down below of what you want to see in future videos, and I'll do my best to make sure that every suggestion happens. So stay tuned for more Miniature Painting 101s. Thank you for watching. Until next time, this is Jay saying, happy painting, everyone.